a few things here, just so we're all on the same page. Let's see. If you have trouble, you can actually call into these meetings. Let me just really brief. There we go. Make sure that's streaming. You can call in. There are instructions, actually. Let me share my screen here. Just point this at me. Yeah. So you should be able to see my screen here. Yeah. And there are instructions here for joining by phone call on our resources page. If for whatever reason you have spotty internet access or whatever, the meeting ID should always be this. And with any of these things, let me know if you have any problems. These first few meetings are probably going to be riddled with errors, but that's expected. I also wanted to point out that the Writing Center is still available. They're doing online meetings for the Writing Center, so be aware that that resource still exists. All right, let me pull over my notes. Doot. Let's see, is there anything else? Nah, okay, so that's the gist of it. So let's go ahead and take a look at the calendar. And everyone can see the calendar, correct? Yeah, okay, I'm seeing some head nods, great. I guess the main thing to point out is the draft research paper. It looks like most folks have theirs in. Let me just pull up the thing here. Yeah, so it looks like almost all of us submitted our draft research paper. So as I mentioned in the email, we do want to go ahead and submit this. What's going to happen is pretty much automatically Canvas will assign you a couple of classmates' drafts to provide comments on. And you're just going to respond to these two comments. When you look at the assignment, when you get someone's paper assigned to you, it won't have entry blanks for this. You'll just have the capability to add a comment. And in that comment, I'd like for you to respond to these two things. One, what do you believe is the draft's strongest aspect? And then two, if this were your draft, what's one way that you would consider revising it? So those will be assigned automatically by Canvas. I'll check after this meeting just to make sure that that's going. Those are actually going to be due on Friday. So we will have a brief, meeting on Friday where we'll take a look at those. But by the end of Friday, I'd like for everyone to respond to that or provide those draft comments. That way everybody will get peer comments. In between now and then, I'm also going to provide comments on your drafts, just audio comments. So look for those this week. That's the gist of how that's going to go. If you submitted your draft research paper, you'll get comments back from me. You'll get peer comments by the end of Friday. Really, the only thing to be aware of now is that you're going to be assigned two of your classmates' drafts, and you just need to provide those by the end of Friday. Are there any questions about that? Okay, fantastic. You've probably done stuff like this before. I don't think what we're doing is is radically different than that. But do let me know if you encounter any problems. Okay, so that's that. Yeah, this is something relevant to point out. So we do have these workshops, right? And normally we get credit for those by participating in those workshops, which means coming to class and doing those. Because this isn't required, synchronous meetings aren't required, basically just if you do the stuff, you'll get credit. So if you submitted a draft, if you do your peer comments, you'll get your credit for that. That's how it's going to work now. since we don't have to be there for the Friday workshops, if you do this stuff, you'll get the credit. Okay. A couple other things to point out. So in looking at people's method designs most recently, and then even back before that, there are some relevant questions about what you're doing with your research. A couple of things to point out is that when we're doing research, we're not presenting established knowledge, right? That falls into report. So, the example I always use is something like, how does an internal combustion engine works? It's not really a research question, it's a report question. What that means for us is when we're thinking about what I'm doing with my research, and then relatedly, how am I answering that question, right? The question of method. We want to think about, what am I doing here? I'm not presenting something that's already established. So am I then adding to that established knowledge, right? This is well known in the field, and I can point to my literature review to show that. So what I'm going to do is apply it to a case where it hasn't been applied, right? That's a good use of established knowledge. I'm not just restating what's already known, I'm applying it to a new place. Am I challenging this? This is something that's well established, and I think, Kaylee dropped out of the chat. She's still in class. That's something she was doing, was looking at established knowledge, but the established knowledge doesn't account for certain exceptions, right? Even something that's established, there are going to be potential exceptions to that. And possibly we need to look at those exceptions in order to have a more nuanced or sophisticated understanding of, this is the case, right? Overall, this is going to be the case with marine organisms. But if you look at these particular classes of animal, it's not going to be the case for them, right? So it's challenging established knowledge. You can also do straight up replication studies. And a lot of that's going on right now. Have folks heard of the replication crisis? Has anyone heard of that? No one has? Okay, fantastic. So right now in the sciences, it's less in the humanities because it doesn't have the same issues of methods being able to be replicable. In the sciences and in the social sciences, for the last several years, there's been attention paid to what's called the reproducibility or the replicability crisis. What's happened is that a lot of sort of significant and established work has been re-examined, and people have tried to replicate the actual experiments or methods used there. So, it kind of started with social science. There were these sort of big novel claims about, if you do this, you get this social effect. Things like, if you change your standing posture, people will be more convinced by you to a significant degree. Things that seemed counterintuitive, right? If you remember our success acronym from the book, things that seemed unexpected, right? If you do this particular thing, you'll get these particular results. So they were interesting, and people tried to reproduce the methods that they used there, and we just weren't seeing the same level of effect. And that was true in the social sciences, and then even in the natural sciences, things where it would seem like, well, this is just an experiment, right? Physics are still the same. So if you're doing this, why aren't you seeing the same effect? It turns out in a lot, sort of across the board, we're just not seeing it. And so there's this real question of what's going on there, right? Is it now just regression to the mean, that doing more and more of the same kind of things, we're just seeing, oh, okay, this is the actual mean of it. Previously, we were seeing things that were more of outliers. Is our ability to repeat things more precise? So we're just seeing clearer results rather than general results. We don't exactly know, but there is this sort of ongoing situation of reproducibility, where we're trying to reproduce things and we just aren't seeing the same results. And so there has been a wave of just straight up reproducing studies, replicating studies. And that's something that is an option for us as well. This is a well-known study, or, at least it's important enough to bother with reproducing. And so I'm just doing a reproduce study, right? I'm going to do exactly what they did and see if the results are the same. So there's lots of things we can do in terms of building upon, extending, re-examining existing knowledge. But when we're doing research, what we're not doing is just repeating what's already known, right? If it's already known, we're not just repeating. That's report, right? We're doing something with the known information to extend it, to challenge it, to reproduce it, whatever. Are there any questions about that? Okay, I bring it up just because it kind of came up in people's method designs, either explicitly or tangentially. Just, a legitimate question about, I have this question, but the question has already been answered by stuff I saw in my lit review. So then, as a researcher, you have to think, well, then what am I doing here, right? If my research question is already pretty thoroughly answered, what am I doing? Probably what I need to do is revise my research question a bit. Yeah. And the other, sort of horn of this is, with the current situation, I suspect what some people were planning to do has changed, right? I mean, it's this whole thing is just thrown a curveball into, well, I was planning to do a survey and now I can't go talk to people because of social distancing or whatever. I guess the folks of us who are here, does anyone have like questions about how they're actually going to do their research? Nobody? Okay. Those of us who are watching this as a recording, feel free to contact me or, come through office hours. I do office hours this way, but we can just talk instead of email. If you're, realistically having to rethink how I'm going to complete my research because I can't go talk to people, or the site I need to go to is closed or whatever. This kind of stuff happens. Just come talk to me and we'll figure it out on a case-by-case basis. Okay, let's see, I think I'm still sharing my screen. So let's go ahead and take a look at this other component. This is the reflection. I'll go ahead and take this. So as the instructions say, basically what I'm going to ask you to do is re-examine your production process. So for the reflection here, as its name implies, it's a reflective document. So it's asking you questions about your work. This kind of work is important because it's where a lot of the learning from this comes from, is reevaluating what you did. These also, these kinds of documents pop up almost now. They're mandatory in professional situations because they're review documents where you identify things like, here's what I used, here's how I spent my time, here's what would be advantageous in the future. So these kinds of reflective documents are ubiquitous in professional and academic situations. So just really briefly, the questions here, and you'll notice all the points are front loaded because this is 5 points, which is, it's not one of the larger components, right? Like, I think our research paper itself is, I think 50. Many of our components are 10. And yeah, okay, let's just go ahead and take a look. Yeah. And even, workshops collectively are 13. So preliminary research and reflection, they don't have a huge amount of grade weight. One of the reasons why is you can do this more quickly, and it's mostly questions about your process. So as long as you fill these out, you'll get full credit, right? It's not like these can be wrong necessarily, as long as you're just doing them appropriately. So all the points here are just kind of front loaded because there's not 5 questions. It's just 5 points overall. As it says, please make certain to respond to the prompts thoroughly, which, maybe about a paragraph each. Again, don't get too hung up on like word counts, but, just do a good faith effort at completing these and it'll be fine. So the first question is the venue. Please identify the venue, the specific journal or conference you selected for your work, and state its associated citation system. So, this whole semester, we previously identified some options for venues. Here, you're just actually targeting, this is the one that I would target with this work, right? And then what's its citation system? In some cases, that's not going to be super clear. A journal will say, if you look, particularly if you go to a journal and look at its information for authors, they will explicitly say, here's the citation system and here are modifications. The other ways to find this out is just look at another work and what citation system it's using. Conferences don't necessarily stipulate, here's the citation system we're using. If that's the case, you can make an assumption, right? I'm using APA because APA is prevalent in this field. That's fine. A conference isn't necessarily going to dictate a citation system. So if you're targeting a conference, you can really just make an educated guess about which one to use, and that's fine. It's the one that your paper is in, assumedly. So discuss why this venue would be an appropriate fit. Considering, for example, your subject matter, right? So it just fits the subject matter. The methods you're using, this journal or conference, it uses quantitative methods. That's what I'm using, so it fits there. Maybe similar works that have already appeared. So remember, we looked at a previous issue of a journal. I think the last time we were in class, or at least that week. And you can point out, well, this recent work talks about the same kind of stuff. Or even, I'm using some work from this journal, and so it seems like mine would probably fit this venue as well. You just want to have an answer for why this venue makes sense. And these are some options you might consider. So that's publication venue. Second, method. Please discuss the particular perspective on your topic that your method afforded, considering, for example, what it allowed you to see and what aspects of the subject it did not address. So anytime you select a method, inherently, you're not doing every other method, right? Every choice kind of inherently precludes every other choice. That's always the case, about anything. Even if you say, well, I'm not going to decide, that still is a choice. So what I want you to do is just think critically about, okay, so given my topic, I did whatever, a survey, an experiment, and that allowed me to see this element of it, right? I got people's feelings and thoughts, or I was able to set up correlation, right? Maybe not causation, but in my experiment, I sure saw that if you plant these flowers, I saw a lot more bees, right? So what did it allow you to see? But then what did it allow you, or what did it not allow you to see within this topic, right? So I got people's thoughts and feelings, but I don't really know, is the coastline receding or not? I just know how people feel about it, right? That's always the case. And that's not a flaw. I mean, that's just how it is. Every answer leaves open an infinite number of questions. So that's what we want to think about here. What did I see through my method, but then what did I not see? And then we've got sort of the reflective questions of time use. Please discuss your workflow and how you managed your time. What I don't want here is just, the dates on the calendar. I already know that. I really just want your personal workflow here. So, I spent a lot of time doing this, and then I didn't have time to do my draft. So I had to do that. I had to really cram that in the night before or whatever. None of this is going to be held against you. I mean, this is as much for you as it is for me, because it helps you identify your own workflow, which is useful for you as well as for me. And then, of course, I plan to do this, and then coronavirus, and now I couldn't, so I had to do this or whatever. So how you spent your time. One significant way you revised your work during our production process, considering, for example, what caused that to happen and how you responded. Gosh, I mean, the shutdown's probably going to be at least one. you could select, although it doesn't have to be that. It could be something like, I got a good piece of pure feedback that said, oh, hey, do this. And it really helped me out, right? So just one way that you revised. And then these are the big three of reflective documents. You almost always see some version of these three. It's what went right. Please discuss your greatest success. So what you think is, the greatest element of your process. That doesn't just mean your research paper. The entire process, what do you feel this was the greatest success? The flip side of that, what went wrong? Please discuss your greatest challenge. Again, I suspect the shutdown will probably come up there. And this doesn't mean, what was my failure, but just, this is something that was a real challenge. And then lastly, lessons learned. So something you learned from this project. So really the whole semester we've been focused on this. What's something you learned that you can apply in the future? That can be very focused, like, well, I found out this thing about my topic, and I'm going to be doing that for my senior paper. I'm already doing it right now, and it really helped me, understand that. It could be that focused. It could be very general. Like, I realized that I really need to set aside time to draft in advance because I was in a real crunch or whatever. So it can be general, it can be specific. It's just one concrete thing that you can take away from this. Are there any questions about any of those? Okay, I'm seeing head shakes. Again, if you do have any questions about this, just please let me know. I realize the situation is weird, but just email me or visit office hours. That's going to be due, we got a bit. It's going to be due end of day on April the 3rd. It will not take you that long. One of the reasons why this is weighted a little lower than some of the others is this is the kind of thing that you can pretty much kind of do in one shot. Unlike most of our other things where I really encourage you to, draft and revise, this is the kind of thing where you probably can kind of sit down and hammer it out. Okay, so that's the reflection. All right, with the time we have remaining, I briefly wanted to go over our reading, just to bring us all up to speed on that. And then we'll take a look at our popular science response for Wednesday. So briefly, taking a look at our reading here, and we will try and do, since there are a few of us here, we will try and do some exercises just to see how that goes. But really briefly, for chapter 16 here, I think I can stop sharing. In our text, I think there are a few important things to point out. This first chapter that we read, chapter 16, which was about condensing, right? So one thing about condensing is a lot of times we've been sort of trained to shoot for length, right? We hit a page count, we hit a word count. And so there's this just like built-in fear of condensing. It's like, well, I've got to hit the page number or the word count. So once I write something, there's no way I'm going to go back and remove that. The more advanced we get, that starts to flip, where you get more and more interested in cutting it back, because as the chapter points out, you start seeing, instead of word counts and page minimums, you start seeing maximums, where it's like it can't go over 15 pages. It can't go over 6,000 words. And so it flips on you, where for academic and professional work, you start having to get it under the wire rather than over the bar, right? So, we have this sort of built-in focus on shooting for length, but condensing becomes a lot more important the more experienced we become. And as the chapter points out, where does it say this? Because it's on page 160. This is really important. It says, he elaborates by saying that brevity comes from selection, not compression, a lesson that requires lifting blocks from the work. So the chapter starts by kind of pointing out, you can either sort of change words, or you can start fiddling with your font size, which is, it's rare you're going to be in a situation where font size is going to help you, right? Where it's like, page numbers. We move more to word count, so font size doesn't really matter. When you're really condensing, it's not so much a question of, well, I can take these 5 words and boil them down to 3. That's important, but it's much more a process of selecting what's the actual story. I mean, the thing I keep trotting out is, I'm doing this work with text mining, but I know a lot of it's just not going to make it in. I've got to select it, right? That's the big crux of condensing. It's not an act of compression, it's an act of selection. What am I actually saying here? And then pruning to get to that core, no matter how long or short this has to be, right? Because you can prune your, several 100-page book into a sentence. You can prune it into a thesis if you have to. And sometimes you do. You have to give someone, here's my pitch, right? This is the argument. And then if they ask, here's an elaboration on that. So that's kind of important. This notion of condensing really is a process of selection. It's actually identifying the core. When you move on from that, here on 161, I think it does give us some good ways to clarify stuff on like the sentence and paragraph level, right? Selection is really a question of like, I'm going to keep these paragraphs in this section, but the rest of it's going to go, right? The other part of the chapter is really about this process of sentence and word level condensing, which is important, but the amount you can condense based on that it's just not a whole ton, right? Selection, you can get rid of, half the work. This process, it's, a percentage. But he does point out some important things here on 161. Redundancies, obvious, although really these should all be the same part of speech. Let's go with probably nouns there, right? So redundancies, obvious information, modifiers, meta discourse, and verbose language. He's violating a grammar rule here. And then he points out what all of these are, right? And I think it is useful. We're not going to pour over this, but if you look at each one of these, it has an example of each one, right? Like, so what's redundant, what's obvious, what's an unnecessary modifier. And then I think it is also useful that he points out that doesn't mean you should get rid of all of these, right? There are necessary modifiers here on page 165, 166, right? This is on the top of 166. The first phase of the reaction sequence, you can't cut out first, right? It's a necessary modifier. So it's not like you have to get rid of those completely, just remove the part of speech. There are some that are necessary. He also points out sometimes it's useful. I think this is on 169 maybe, where, yeah, or no, excuse me, I think it's 171 and 170 to 173. There are times where it's still important to keep what he calls flow and coherence words, right? There is language that could be removed, but is still necessary for making sense, right? So this isn't just a process of cut everything that can be cut. You're still retaining what's necessary for comprehension. That is our main principle is clarity. Getting rid of things like redundancies and obvious and obvious passages. Clarity, right? It's not just getting rid of them to get rid of them. It's that they actually work better once the fat is trimmed away. He also points out things like the that when you're doing a draft, of course, don't get hung up on this. Drafts are full of this kind of stuff, but we go through revision processes to get rid of this. Okay, what I wanted to do is actually just briefly do some work with the exercises here. We don't have a whole ton of time. So what I want us to do, and we'll just do it individually rather than try a breakout room this first time and try and manage all of that. Just individually, let's take just a couple of minutes, pick one of the sentences here at the bottom of 173, where it says edit, condense the following. Pick one of those sentences individually, take just a minute and think about how you might revise that, and then we will come together as a class and work through all three of them. Okay, so take just a minute, pick one of those and condense it down. Let's take a look at that. Take just another moment with that if we could, please. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and unmute everybody.
That are in it that are bad.
Oops. Chris, I'm getting a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and mute yours. Did anyone do that first one?
I did.
Who was that, Wes?
Yeah.
Yeah. What did you have for that, Wes?
I said
It's okay,
polyaromatic hydrocarbons and polychlorinated biphenyls is challenging as it costs a lot of money and threatens the health of people exposed. So I pretty much just like flipped around the first sentence, took out this the colon, and like just put it all into one sentence.
Okay, could you say that for us again?
I said remediation of polyaromatic hydrocarbons and polychlorinated biphenyls is challenging and costs a lot of money, threatening as well as threatens the health of workers exposed to the compounds.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's one thing we can do is instead of using that is challenging to remediate, we can, front load that. Remediating those is challenging, right? We might even be able to potentially, if we knew more about this subject, is what it's saying the challenges, I think it's saying those are the challenges, right? Because it's a colon.
Yeah.
So it's saying it's challenging to remediate because of these reasons, which means we probably don't even need to say challenging, right?
Yeah.
Remediating polyaromatic hydrocarbons and polychlorinated, was it biphenyls?
I think so.
Costs a lot of money, or, we could even just say is expensive.
Mm-hmm.
And it threatens the health of workers who are exposed to the compounds. We could potentially that to something like is dangerous to workers who are
I
exposed.
don't really think I can cut anything out though, as everything in that kind of seems important and relevant to what they're talking about. So
What's that?
I couldn't really cut anything out. I pretty much just reworded it.
Yeah, well, and that's a great point. That, I mean, if we're not familiar with this discourse, what we can do is precisely that, right? We can't really make cuts if we don't know. We probably can assume when it says challenging, it's those because those follow a colon, and that's what a colon does.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, we don't know. When you say, threatens the health of workers, is that the same as dangerous or not? But I mean, that's a good point, that since we'll know this, we can make condensation. We can condense things in ways that other people can't.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. What about that second one? Did anyone do B by any chance? Nobody did B?
I did.
Oh, you did? Yeah, Lauren, what did you have?
I put chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B express similar patterns of transcript abundance in plants at different developmental stages.
Yeah, so what did you condense there?
Kind of just took out some words and just switched it around a little bit because I don't know, I didn't think like said when they were observed was necessary, and the like when expressions was kind of like, I don't know, could have just been put after, and then you don't really need to know the compared, because to me I think that's pretty, like, it's self-explanatory, like of course they're being compared type
Right.
deal. So
Yeah, so the chapter calls a lot of that meta discourse, right? When expression of chlorophyll A, that's chlorophyll, is that what you, A and B?
I think so, yeah.
Okay, we're compared, right? So what it's describing what's happening, right? When we compare this stuff, you don't need that, right? So as you point out, that meta discourse can be removed, right? Transcript abundance showed similar patterns in plants at different developmental stages. Yeah. Yeah, so the chapter talks about that, right? Meta discourse. We don't need to point that kind of stuff out. A lot of times we're in the habit of doing that. I think because it's a way of hedging what we're saying, right? A lot of times we feel weird about just saying something is true. And so we couch it in stuff like, well, when I did this, this is what happened. And so what I think, increasingly, that's just fluff, right? This is what happens. You know, the more experienced you get, the more comfortable you are just making assertions, right? This is what the information shows. Now, this last one, this is a paragraph here. Did anyone take this one on? Oh, Christine, how did you condense this one?
Excuse me. I wrote, inherent resistance is an evolved response to harsh living environments. Inherent resistance doesn't require physiological mechanism in response to an imposed stress. Inherently resistant plants are characterized by high root biomass, extensive chemical defenses, and relatively low maximum potential growth rates.
Yeah, I think that's really good. The one thing potentially is 3 times we had inherent resistance, right? Is there any way to groom that out, do you think?
I think it was important to keep it at least in that first sentence. In the short time, I couldn't figure out how to take that second sentence and take inherent resistance out without keeping it in context. So
yeah,
it was a time thing for me. But yes, I agree that inherent resistance 3 times was a lot.
Yeah, I mean, one idea might be something like this. The book actually suggests this. It says inherent resistance is an evolved response to living in constantly harsh environments. That's very similar to what you had. Resistant plants don't induce a physiological response to stress. Rather, they have traits such as high root biomass, extensive chemical defenses, and low growth rates.
Yeah.
So maybe that's one, again, where I would defer to someone who's an expert in this to ascertain, is that the same, or is it important to retain essentially a piece of jargon, right? I mean, it's jargon in the sense of being a disciplinary term. Is it important to retain that, or can we pull that out through something like this? Yeah. Anyway, so these are just some examples of the things the book points out in this chapter. And I do think these are useful, these notions of things like redundancies, things being obvious. And again, it's not the kind of thing necessarily where you're going to write your draft like this. I mean, you get better with practice, but I mean, nobody's first draft is free of all this stuff. It's a first draft. But that's why it's so important for us to do revision and then ultimately editing, right? And that's why the big thing we need when we do work is time. You know, it's the most precious commodity. We just don't do our best work super crunched. Everyone's always on a deadline, but it does mean, you know, you just have to build that into your deadline that, you know, I need to draft here because there's just no way, you know, I'm going to get good work if I put it off till later. It's one of the hardest things, but I mean, you're always under deadlines. Okay. You know what we'll do is we'll take a look at these other chapters later in the week. I don't want to try and shoehorn those in. What we'll do last here is we'll just take a quick look at, sorry, I'm sharing my screen, at the popular science response for next time, and then we'll just wrap it up here. So as I mentioned, we're just sort of starting the loop again. We're going back to now finding another infographic. And boy, I just saw a couple. I mean, you know, the news is so dominated right now by coronavirus stuff, excuse me, that I'm seeing a lot of these things, you know, pop up, but it's all on one subject. Locate an infographic, a visual document that presents digested data that communicates science information for a broad readership. It may be helpful to search for science infographic, then respond to the following prompts. These are things we've already seen, right? There are no changes. So we've done the questions before. Just cite it, summarize it, look at its effectiveness as a visual document, right? So this is really the rhetoric question. How is it working? How is it communicating? And then lastly, this question of source fidelity. How is it communicating its information, right? Is it, where is it making choices? Is it being faithful? Those kinds of things. So we're just starting the loop over again. This time we're looking at infographics. All right, that's the gist of what we wanted to cover today. Does anyone have any questions right now? Okay, so for Wednesday, you know, I guess the consistent thing is a lot of the class is moving pretty similar to how it did before the shutdown. So just make sure to have that in before class time Wednesday. I will have these live sessions for the rest of the semester. As I mentioned, it is not required for you to participate. You'll be able to finish everything asynchronously. I do really encourage you to participate, and I appreciate it. But it is not mandatory. I just want to make that clear. Any other questions about anything right now? Okay, folks. So I'll check and make sure that Canvas is allocating the peer comment stuff. And I'll remind you about this, but you do just want to make sure you have those in by end of day Friday. Okay, folks. Thanks so much. I will hopefully see you on Wednesday. See ya.